Hello, readers, and welcome to our lesson today on how characters move along the plot. So, I know that you guys have been doing some work with plot and you've been doing some work with characters. And so, today we're going to kind of put those two things together and we're going to talk about how the characters actually move along the plot. So, I pulled up to start just a typical plot mountain here and the different parts of it. The exposition, of course, where it begins. And in the exposition, we learn lots about the characters and the setting and kind of what's going on with the people. And then the rising action is kind of where the character faces some conflict. And so the character moves along the plot because not only are they facing the conflict, but they're reacting to it. And then we have the climax, of course, which is the most exciting part of the story. And it's kind of where the story starts turning around. The problems start getting solved. And then we have the following action, which is just the events to the end of the story. And then, of course, the resolution is the actual end of the story. So what we're going to do today is I am going to read you one of my favorite books called A Day's Work by Eve Bunting. And as I read it to you, I'm going to talk about how the main characters of this book are moving along the plot. So we might go from the book back to here to the chart, the anchor chart, and then we, of course, will go back to the book. And I'm going to kind of give you my thoughts on this. And then I'm going to ask you to do some thinking too. I wish there was a way we could share, but maybe in your chat you can share today. But I really want to talk to you about how these two characters are moving along the plot in A Day's Work. So let's go ahead and start reading it. Some of you might have already heard this book, which is fine. But we really want to focus on the characters, and the characters are the grandfather and then Francisco. So I'm going to just start reading it. Francisco stood in the parking lot with his grandfather and the other men. It was the first time he'd ever been there. A truck cruised along and slowed. The driver held up 3 fingers. Bricklaying. I need 3 men, he called. 5 men jumped in the back. Only 3, the driver said, and 2 had to get out. The workers left in the parking lot grumbled and shuffled around. Francisco's grandfather shivered. Haste frio, he said. It is cold because it's still early. It will get hot later, you will see, Francisco said in Spanish. Why did you bring a kid? One of the men asked. No one will hire you with a kid. He belongs in school. It's Saturday, Francisco said. My abuela, my grandfather, does not speak English yet. He came to California only 2 days ago to live with my mother and me. Francisco swallowed. We have been alone since my father died. I am going to help my abuelo get work. He took his grandfather's cold, rough hand and smiled up at him. Abuelo was tall and skinny as an old tree. Already, Francisco loved him. When there was money to spare, he'd get him a jacket like Francisco's with sleeves long enough to cover his hand, and an LA Lakers cap like Francisco's too. So right now we're still kind of in that introduction point. We've learned a little bit. Francisco, his dad died, and he's helping his grandfather, Abuela, who doesn't speak any English, try to get a job. We know they're in California and they're waiting for people to come up. So the author's done a great job kind of giving us an introduction to the two of them here. They haven't really moved the plot yet because we're still at the introduction. So let's see what happens next with our 2 characters to move our plot along. A van was coming. Benjamin's gardening was printed on the side. Francisco let go of his grandfather's hand. He darted through the swarm of men and was right in front of the van when it stopped. 1 man, the driver said, for gardening. He was young with a thick black mustache, and he was wearing an LA Lakers cap like Francisco. Maybe cleaner. It must be an omen, Francisco thought. Take us, Mr. Benjamin, us. Francisco pointed back to his grandfather. He tilted his own cap over his eyes. Look, we love the Lakers too, and my grandfather is a fine gardener, although he doesn't know English yet. The gardens are all the same, right? Mexican and American? Francisco waved urgently for his grandfather to come. Also, you will get 2 for 1, he said. I don't charge for my work. So here we can kind of see Francisco doing something to make the plot move along. He's like actively going up to Mr. Benjamin and asking for this job. The man grinned. Okay, I'm convinced, but I'm not Mr. Benjamin. Call me Ben. He motioned to Francisco. You and your grandfather jump in the back. $60 for the day. Francisco nodded. His breath was coming fast. That much for a day's work? Mama would be so happy. Her job didn't pay much. There'd be extra food tonight, maybe Churritos. He pulled open the back door, threw in the bag of lunch Mama had packed, and hurried his grandfather into the van ahead of him. A big, tough guy tried to get in too. Francisco pushed him back. He was tough. He was a worker. It is gardening, he told Abuelo as the van pulled away. But I do not know gardening. I am a carpenter. I have always lived in the city. It is easy, Francisco waved through the window at the passing cars. Flowers, roses, things like that. He raised his cap to a lady in the car. Senora, he said politely, though she couldn't hear. The van turned off the freeway into the winding road and stopped. A sloping bank led to the backyards of new houses. Some were not yet finished. Workers climbed on rooftops, and there was a good smell of tar. The high bank was dotted with pretty white flowers and overgrown with coarse green spikes. 6 big black trash cans waited below. They all got out of the van, but Ben left the motor running. So I noticed something here. It says that he doesn't know gardening. He's a carpenter. So, but Francisco's like, it's fine. Well, it's just flowers and stuff. But I'm starting to think that maybe, if you think about it, we're kind of going here to our rising action. We're starting to see something that might be leading us to a conflict. And it's because Francisco is kind of pushing this work. And he's doing it not just to be mean. He's doing it because they need the money. But he's kind of pushing it. So let's see what happens next. I need you to weed this bank, he told Abuela. Be sure to get the roots. He pointed to the cans. Dump them here. Good, fine. It was Francisco who answered. I have another job to go to, Ben said. I'll pick you up at 3. It will be hot. Your grandfather will need a hat. He took a straw one from the van. Gracias, Abuelo said. See you guys then. Work hard. Have a nice day. What did he say? Abuela asked as the van drove off. He said to have a nice day. It is what everyone says up here. Your English is very good, my grandson, Abuela said. Francisco nodded and smiled. He climbed the bank and hung his jacket on the railing. He said, I will show you. He pulled up one of the spiky clumps and shook the dirt from its root. These are weeds. Do not touch the flowers. His grandfather smiled. Bueno. Francisco could see his strong white teeth all the way to the back. They worked through the morning. A little poodle barked at them through the railings above. Yap, yap, yap. An orange cat prowled the bank. There was a pool in one of the new backyards. Francisco could hear splashing and voices. The water sounds made him hotter. His shoulders and arms hurt. He thought about how proud Mama would be tonight. $60, she'd say, and she'd hug Francisco and Abuelo. It's a fortune. At lunchtime, he and Abuela ate the tortillas and tomatoes and drank a bottle of water she had packed. In another hour, they were finished. The bank looked so nice with just the brown dirt and the pretty flowers. Muy bueno, Abuela said. And Francisco said, yes, beautiful. He and his grandfather shook hands. Francisco thought he never felt so good. He helped his grandfather and he worked himself. They sat on the curb to wait for the van, and when it came, they stood and brushed the loose dirt from their clothes. Ben got out and stared up at the bank. "Holy Toledo," he said. "You didn't think we could do such a fine job," Francisco wanted to laugh. Ben seemed so shocked. Francisco gave him a little jump and pretended to slam dunk a ball. "Like the Lakers, we work hard." "I can't believe it," Ben whispered. You took out all the plants and left the weeds." Francisco stepped closer to Abuelo. "But the flowers," he began. Ben pointed. "Those flowers are chickweed. Chickweed. You took out my young ice plants." He yanked off his Lakers cap and slammed it against the van. So now you can see Francisco's really moved our plot along. We really know what the conflict is. Him saying that his grandfather knew gardening, him saying that what the flowers were and what the weeds were, are kind of getting us to our problem here. We're getting really close to seeing how this turns out. Ben is really mad right now. You can tell because he slammed his hat against the van. "What is it? Did we do something wrong?" Abuelo whispered in Spanish. To Francisco, Ben's mustache quivered with anger. "I thought you said your grandfather was a fine gardener. He doesn't even know a chickweed." Abuelo looked from one of them to the other. "Tell me what is happening, Francisco," he said. "We left the weeds. We took out the plants," Francisco said softly in Spanish. It was hard to look at his grandfather as he spoke. "He thought you knew about gardening," Abuelo said. His Spanish was fast and angry. "You lied to him. Isn't that so? We needed a day's work. We do not lie for work." So now you can kind of see that both of the characters are doing something. So we have an issue here. We have a big problem. And we don't just have the problem that they pulled the wrong thing out. We have the problem that Francisco lied. And we're going to see how grandfather kind of moves it for that. He says, "We don't lie for work." Now there was more sadness than anger in Abuela's voice. "Ah, my grandson." He put a hand on Francisco's shoulder. "Ask him what we can do. Tell him we will come back tomorrow. If he agrees, we will pull out the weeds and put the good plants back." Francisco felt his heart go weak. But Abuelo, that will be twice the work. And tomorrow is Sunday. There's a Lakers game on TV, and there's also church. He hoped the word church would perhaps change his grandfather's thinking. "Then we will miss them both," his grandfather said. "It is the price of a lie. Tell the gentleman what I said and ask him if the plants will live." Ben said they would. The roots are still there. If they were replanted early, they'll be all right. He rubbed his eyes. "This is partly my fault. I should have stayed to get you started. But tell your grandfather I appreciate his offer and I will bring you back in the morning." The three of them got into the van. So now you can see that the problem's kind of getting solved. The grandfather's like, "We're going to do this. We're going to fix our problem. We're going to do what's right." And so Ben's no longer mad. So we're now kind of going here. The grandfather, Francisco, kind of got us into the issue, and grandfather's kind of pushed the plot along by creating like the resolution here. Francisco sat by the window in huddled silence. He didn't wave to passing cars. He didn't raise his cap. He helped his grandfather find work, but in the end, the lie had spoiled the day. His throat burned with tears. The parking lot was empty. The trash cans overflowed with used paper cups. Ben let them out. "Look," he said, "if you need money, I'll give you half now." He began to pull his wallet from his pocket, but Abuelo held up his hand. "Tell him we will take the pay tomorrow when we finish." Francisco's grandfather and Ben looked at each other, and words seemed to pass between them, though there were no words. Ben slid his wallet back into his pocket. Francisco sighed. The lie had taken the Cerritos too. "Tomorrow then, 6 a.m., Ben said, and tell your grandfather I can always use a good man for more than just one day's work." Francisco gave a hop of excitement. More than just at one day's work, Ben was still speaking. The important things your grandfather knows already, and I can teach him gardening. Francisco nodded. He understood. He would tell his grandfather, and he would tell him something else. He, Francisco, had begun to learn the important things too. Francisco took his grandfather's cold, rough hands in him. Let's go home, Abuela, he said. So, this book is a wonderful book, but I really wanted to point out to you how the characters move the plot. If Francisco would not have told Ben that his grandfather was a gardener when he wasn't, then we really wouldn't have moved our plot. That in itself moved us up toward the climax. And if grandfather would have been like, well, we worked, give us the money, then our climax would have been very different. So the characters and the characters' actions are kind of what moves the plot along. So today, as you're reading a book, I want you to notice your main characters, and I want you to think about the events, the things that those characters are doing to move the plot along. All right, readers, have a good time reading your books and make sure you pay attention to those characters and how they're moving along the plot.